We are so excited to have on the show today Patrick Casale, who is an AuDHD licensed mental health addictions therapist in Asheville, North Carolina. Patrick is the owner of All Things Private Practice and Resilient Mind Counseling. He also works as a private practice coach and strategist. He's a motivational speaker and an international retreat planner. Patrick hosts 2 different podcasts, All Things Private Practice, and he co-hosts Divergent Conversations. His work has helped and inspired thousands of mental health professionals to take risks, start and grow their businesses, and invest in themselves. And Patrick is super passionate about advocacy for reducing shame and stigma of mental health, as well as imposter syndrome. He loves good coffee, craft beer, playing soccer, and traveling all around the world. Patrick's official motto is doubt yourself, do it anyway. I absolutely love that motto. All right, let's get into this conversation with Patrick. Hello, we have Patrick Casale here in the house today. I'm so excited to have this conversation. Thank you for being here with us today, Patrick. One of the things that I just want to say right off the bat is that I appreciate you so much for so many reasons, and we'll get into those reasons in a little bit. But as a new private practice owner a couple of years ago, you had created this incredible community, and it was specifically for people who were interested in starting their own private practice. Oftentimes, as mental health practitioners, we are not set up to have the business knowledge that we need to start a private practice. And you were so generous to set up a free space on social where anyone who's interested in starting their own group or their own solo practice could come in that space, and you provided a tremendous number of resources for us. And it is there that I learned that you identify as an AuDHD entrepreneur. And for anyone who is not familiar with that, AuDHD is having both ADHD and autism, or being identifying as both having ADHD and being autistic. And that was new terminology for me, even as a mental health therapist. And so I'd love to just start out by hearing more about your story of when you first learned that you have this diagnosis.
Yeah. What am I, 37 now, going on 38. I think I was diagnosed autistic at 35. So it had been a situation where I had a ADHD diagnosis probably from 6-7 years ago, and that felt pretty fitting. And I don't think I really felt any sort of way about that diagnosis. I was just kind of like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Creativity bursts, get bored easily, distracted easily, all the things that come alongside ADHD a lot of the time. And I just kept struggling with the feeling of fitting in. Like, I think a lot of autistic people often say, like, it feels like I've never fully arrived. That's how it feels for a lot of people. I don't know how to do this life thing. And it was this constant feeling of like, socially and interpersonally, I just have a hard time receiving the feelings that people are like, oh, they love me, they care about me. I can logically rationalize that, but a lot of the times emotionally, it's really hard to access that connection to those things. And one day a friend of mine was like, I think you should just go get tested for autism. I think that's probably like this lifelong mystery. And I was like, no, that can't be me. That's not a thing. I was definitely like really entrenched in my own internalized ableism about the autistic terminology diagnostically, and my own preconceived notions of what autism is, what it looks like, who's autistic, etc. So probably like delayed like 6-7 months after that, finally decided, I was like, I'll just go get tested and we'll rule this out. And it went the other way, pretty cut and dry, really. And then, the last couple of years have certainly been a lot of learning and figuring things out as I go.
Can you tell us about that moment then when you got that phone call?
Yeah, I was a little angry, honestly. Like, I think I was angry with the psychologist who I didn't really enjoy working with. Um, and I think it was about the way he kind of phrased, you know, reviewing the results over the phone. Like, well, here's the results, and you're going to have a lot of support needs in your life, and a lot of accommodations, and a lot of these things, and these things, and these things. And I was like, well, I'm already 35. Like, I don't have any of those things in place right now. I don't understand what's going to be so different. And ultimately ended up calling my wife because I was in New York at the time at a conference, and she was like, "Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Like, I'm not surprised by that." And I don't think that's the reaction I wanted. I appreciate the fact that there was a lot of acceptance, but I was really looking to process the information more. And it's been a long journey of unpacking that, figuring out what autism means to me, unlearning certain things in terms of like language usage, perception, etc. Moving much more into an identity first space, and really trying to figure out a way to create as much neurodivergent affirming knowledge and care for not only my group practice staff, my podcasts, my coaching clients, like all across the board. So that's kind of become front and center entrepreneurially for me.
Yeah, it's interesting when you say identity first language. As clinicians who are in the space of really creating inclusive environments, we've been taught for a long time to use person first language. So, saying, for example, a person with autism. And identity first language is something that I'm hearing more recently in terms of that actually being more, I want to say inclusive, but more in terms of like really seeing someone for the ways that they see themselves and what is central for that individual. And so I understand from you, from a recent training that I attended that you did, which was phenomenal, by the way, that it really depends on the individual. And there's not some blanket rule that some people do still prefer person centered language first, but many individuals really prefer identity first language. Like I can say I prefer saying I'm a brown woman, not a woman who is Egyptian. I'm an Egyptian American cisgender woman. Those are really central parts of my identity. And one of the things that I want to also thank you for is when we did that training, or when I attended your training more recently in Norway, um, that was the first time that you and I had met. And you were talking about how there's a grief and relief process with getting this diagnosis. And I'm going to speak more to that on for myself in a moment, but I love to just hear from you more on what that actually meant for you.
I think that there's a lot of research and polling that says 84% of people who are autistic would prefer identity first language. And I did a training yesterday, which was about how to create a neurodivergent affirming private practice and workplace culture. And people were asking, well, how come that actually feels demeaning? Why would you call yourself autistic? We don't say, like, I'm schizophrenic. And the reality is, autism is a neurotype, and autism impacts all areas of life holistically. I said this yesterday. I don't get to pick and choose when I'm autistic. Like, I don't get to leave my autism at the door in certain situations. And I think the reality is, when we talk about person first, when we talk about the medical model, even, we're talking about disorders, we're talking about symptomology, we're talking about things that can be alleviated over time or suppressed or kind of othered from the personhood. And I think that you can't do that with autism. You can't do that with ADHD. Like, we can't separate the two. So the ability to say I am autistic allows you to say, like, this is a part of my personhood, opposed to like, I am a person who has autism, which implies like I am managing this disorder. And it's just not the same thing as saying I'm managing the symptoms of schizophrenia or anxiety or bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
It's just quite different. So I think that's why the identity first movement is really on the rise.
Hmm.
And again, to your point, I don't ever want to like convince someone who is a part of a marginalized group of how I should identify myself or how I should speak about myself. But I do think we have a long way to go in the medical and mental health communities where a lot of outdated, unaffirming language is used pretty regularly and routinely.
One of the things that you had said in the training that I went to a couple months ago was that it is really about managing your whole environment to regulate your nervous system. And that is not something that is just adjunctive that can be put to the side, this kind of thing that kind of comes and goes. It is something that is central to the way that a person, an autistic person, moves through the world all of the time, all of the times, plural. I mean, it's a constant regulation, um, noticing any dysregulation, trying to stay at neutral all the time, and managing that the ups and the downs of the nervous system getting activated, of the sounds that come in, of all the stimuli that go on, both externally and internally. So that
Yeah,
makes sense to me. Mhm.
absolutely. Yeah, it's not something that you can just switch off.
Yeah.
And there's still such a negative stigma slash connotation with the label and the language in general. So it makes sense why people opt for the person first language, because I think it's still really hard for people to come to terms with certain diagnoses in our lifetime. And despite the advocacy efforts that are going on.
Mhm.
Um, Now, to answer your other question about the grief relief process, something Megan and I, Dr. Neff and I talk a lot about on our podcast, Divergent Conversations. Um, the grief and relief of diagnosis that is so heavy because it's not something like a diagnosis that we know is going to go away. We know, like, once you find out, there's not like symptom management as if, like, oh, I just found out I have anxiety. I'll figure out like some breathing techniques and some mindfulness techniques and strategies. It's not like that. And I think for those of us who are later in life diagnosed, there's like this searching constantly of like, we have very analytical brains and we always want to understand the why.
Yeah.
The why behind why has life felt the way that it's felt, and why has it been challenging, and why has it been such a struggle in social environments? Why has it been so lonely and isolating in so many ways? Like all of the things that come with this diagnosis, where you start to see life through a completely different lens. Things start to make sense more. Things start to fall into place. It doesn't make life much easier, but it does make life easier to conceptualize and understand. And I think there's grief in that. I think there's grief with any diagnosis that feels lifelong, that feels impactful, that feels like it's going to present challenges. I think that there's grief in, well, what would have life have looked like if the first 35 years of my life I had known this? What would life have looked like if my parents had known this? What if we had the proper supports in place to support what I needed? So there's grief in that. And there's relief in understanding like the why. And I think that that's something that we're all looking for, is the why. Because then it starts to make sense. Like you start to reevaluate social situations. You start to reevaluate, when can I safely mask and unmask? When can I be myself? What is it like to even be myself if I've masked for 35 years of life? Like, what do I even enjoy doing? Who do I even enjoy spending time with? I think there's relief in knowing what to do when you are having a shutdown or a meltdown, or you're feeling really overwhelmed, or when you start to finally understand why social situations and interactions have gone the way that they've gone, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of understanding that starts to come into play.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what we often talk about with grief and relief.
The grieving process, I think it's huge in terms of, um, how could things have been different had I known this? Do you ever feel, Patrick, that there was some kind of knowing that you had?
No, not really. And really because I just didn't know enough about autism or neurodivergence in general. I didn't really start paying attention to any of it until this diagnosis. I think that beforehand, I was just kind of like, there's a lot of people who are autistic who have been misdiagnosed with things throughout life, like bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, complex PTSD, et cetera, et cetera. And while there are so many comorbidities and co occurring diagnoses with autism, ADHD, the reality is none of those really fit.
Mhm.
But I never thought much more of it other than like, I guess it's just another misdiagnosis or a missed opportunity, or I'm just never going to figure this out. And that's kind of which led me to pursue diagnosis in general was I don't think I'm ever going to figure this out. And that can feel so crushing and
Mhm.
demoralizing emotionally to just be like, I think that life is destined to feel really complicated and really confusing.
Not in the necessarily knowing in neurotypical people, but my experience just feels a little different from what I'm seeing in other folks in terms of what I suspect they're experiencing. And I say this life thing a lot. Like I know that for me being an Enneagram 4, I'm really into the Enneagram. I always thought that people around me just seemed to be doing this life thing a little bit easier than I did. I always thought it was because I was bicultural. I always thought it was because I just thought differently, which we'll get to that. And I remember being in Norway at this training that you and I both presented in, and we were in one city, and we were traveling to another city. The trip was set up to travel to another city. And you had left a little early and you traveled on your own while most of the rest of us were set up to go in these two buses. And so you had already gotten to our destination a little bit, maybe a couple hours or a day before. I can't remember exactly. And I remember sitting in the bus, and it's beautiful scenery on this drive that's about an hour and a half long. I mean, absolutely stunning scenery in February in Norway. We're about 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle. We're seeing the fjords, and there's the driver is serving also as the tour guide and is talking a lot because there's a lot to mention and to speak on. It's gorgeous, and sharing history and what's where and what this means and what that is, and it was interesting, to be fair. And there were a couple of folks on the bus who were asking a lot of questions, and I found myself getting more irritated, more irritated, more irritated. Every question that would come up, I started to feel like I'm going to jump out of my skin. And I start getting that firm upper lip, right? To my tail. My nostrils are flaring. I can feel my face changing. And so I don't want to be rude. And I'm moving, I'm changing direction of my head so that no one sees my face because I feel like I have no control over my face at this point. And we got off of the bus, and that particular day, being on the bus was painful for me. So I was in a wheelchair afterwards, and I was sitting in the lobby while there was a lot of commotion going on, and I was kind of off to the side from everyone. And you were there. Actually, let's back up. As I'm first walking in, I was ambulatory at that point. So I'm first walking in, you were walking out, and I said, "Good decision on going out here by yourself." And you were just like, "Okay." And I went in, and then I think my husband got me a wheelchair, and I was put off to the side by request. And later, you were kind of hanging around, and I said, "Do you know where the restroom is?" And you said, "It's upstairs." Well, at this point, I'm feeling pretty defeated because I don't feel like I can walk any further. And you said, "There's an elevator there. Do you want me to take you up?" I said, "Yeah, I'd really appreciate it." I think that's all I could muster to say. And as we're going into the elevator, there's a mirror in there, and the mirror is facing us as we're going in. And I felt that you could probably see the tears welling up in my eyes and the reflection from the mirror. And I said, "They just wouldn't shut the fuck up on the bus." As if people are required to sit quietly and not comment on the beautiful countryside that we were driving through. And you didn't say anything. It was one of the I'm gonna cry now. It was, a moment of so much grace that you showed, and you said nothing, and as you
pushed me up towards the restroom. He said, "Might be time to get that autism assessment, Mona." And I just nodded. And I knew that, but I didn't wanna name it yet. I knew it because of what you had shared in your training a couple of days prior. I just wasn't ready to say it yet. And so I really started that grief and relief process in that moment. That's not something I think I've ever told you, but I just wanna thank you for giving me that gentle nudge, pardon the pun, as you're pushing me along there. I really, really appreciate it. And so immediately when I got back, I was really fortunate enough to be able to have an appointment within a week. Um, and then a week later got the formal diagnosis of being autistic. And it's interesting for me at this point to go through that grief relief process of being able to name. And you've probably heard me say many times the power of naming helps us put language to an experience that we're having, and so we can bridge that connection in our brains, and in our own spirits of what's happening in our worlds. And so the power of naming was a huge part of the relief for me. But being 50 years old and having children who are either adults or almost adults now, um, and thinking of all the ways that I could have parented differently, and thinking of the ways that I could have, noticed signs of neurodivergence in my own kids and understood it more. There's a huge grief process that comes with that, huge grief process. And also the relief of being able to own this part of myself now and put a name to it and really stand in that empowers me to name my needs much easier now. Yeah. It's a lot different than it was. My life feels a lot different than it did 3 months ago. I'm curious for you being an entrepreneur, what that's like being in leadership, um, and being autistic.
Yeah. Well, one, I want to just say thank you for sharing that. I think that it's a gift that I have always had to really be intuitive in terms of like picking up on other people's experiences. So now I think the intuitive nature has become annoying to some of my friends when I'm like, I know you're autistic without you telling me you're autistic. And it's just this innate ability to just understand the experiences based on the fact that we're so often tracking facial expressions and body language and response and really seeing behind the curtain a little bit more, I think, for people. So I in the elevator that day, I was just like, I think this is where we're at.
What tipped you off?
I mean, I got some sense just meeting you in Norway. Like, I didn't really get that sense via DM or voice memo or whatever. It's a little harder in those regards. But I think I just could tell, like, socially, there was a lot of energy it took for you to be social and to be in these loud, noisy, chaotic environments. And it made sense why you were off to the side a lot of the time with a
Oh,
couple of
that's
people
right.
specifically.
That's
And
right.
I was like, huh, this is interesting. And then you said, oh, well, my husband, ABC. And I was like, also interesting. I see
Mhm,
that, but also I'm like picking up on much more than that. It's
mhm,
never really my place to say it though to someone who's not asking for that feedback. I
mhm.
just felt like you needed to hear it in that moment because I thought it would alleviate some of the feelings that you were having because I know what it's like to go into shutdown mode, and to not feel like you can escape from it is really overwhelming.
Yeah, and the camouflaging too. Um, and that was language that I was learning. I knew about masking just from being Egyptian American, but the camouflaging was a new one for me. And that's exactly what I was doing when I was sitting in the bus and I was turning my head because I couldn't control my face. I was hiding it. And
Yeah,
that's different than putting on a mask, and presenting a certain way. It's actually hiding a certain kind of behavior or
for
um,
sure.
presentation. Yeah.
I think pre-diagnosis, I would not have left that island to go to the city by myself. I would have endured it. I was not enjoying myself because I can't sit still. I have to be doing something all the time. And the fact that it's getting pitch black at 3 p.m., it's freezing cold, we're in the middle of nowhere, there's nothing to do. I'm like,
Right.
this is not working for me.
It-
And I also, as a speaker at the event, felt very grateful to be invited to that, but I also didn't want to participate in the event. So like having my options restricted based on location was challenging. And I was just like, I've got to get out of here. So I've noticed as I've become more comfortable talking about this, as I've become more comfortable modeling in certain environments, that I've done this more and more. And this has even happened in my own retreats. I can think specifically for examples, but I always start retreats off when we were doing like welcome party, intention setting, whatever the fuck we want to call it.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, hey, so most of you know who I am. Most of you are probably here for a reason, but I just want to reemphasize, like, I'm autistic, ADHD. I'm going to pace. I'm going to like move around a lot. I'm not going to make a lot of eye contact. There may be moments where like I've become so overstimulated that communication becomes more challenging. I might become more direct or really like short and blunt. I want to encourage all of you to do what you need to do in order to soothe your systems too. But more importantly, there may be times where I actually have to remove myself from the environment for X amount of time. And giving that permission to other people as guests, because I know what it's like to be like a guest in an event where I'm like, I have to be here. I have to show up. I have to like sit through every single training or be present for everything. And I would really have to white knuckle it in a lot of ways. And so we were in Lisbon during a Portugal event in October. And we did like a full day tour in Lisbon. It's a busy city. There's a lot going on. We did a lot of walking. It was hot. I was so overwhelmed by the time the tour got over. And we were then moving into a space where it was like, okay, in an hour, we're all meeting for local music and dinner at this little restaurant. And I walked into that. And I think once we get past our point of no return in terms of our sensory system shutting down, everything becomes amplified and magnified. So like my feet were throbbing. Everything that felt hot was so much hotter. Everything was so much louder. And I walked in and it was stuffy and it was hot. And it only sat like our group of 30. And I walked in, I was like, nope, can't do it. So fortunately, everything had been paid for and taken care of. I told everyone, I'm like, I'm going back. I'm taking an Uber to the retreat center. Y'all have fun.
Peace out.
We'll see you in the morning. And it was the best decision I could have made, because in the past, I would have forced myself to sit through that and to endure it for the next 2 or 3 hours. I would have been miserable. I would not have been social. I would have drank more than I wanted to in order to be able to exist in that environment. And then the next day, I would have paid for it significantly more. So by modeling that, and just highlighting the fact that like sometimes this has to happen. And if I'm going to run these events all over the world, there's never going to be a moment where I'm not experiencing overwhelm. So being able to give myself permission to do that, to step away, to leave, those are new behaviors that I would not have done a year ago, 2 years ago, etc.
Yeah, because it really is, in terms of belonging, it really is a celebration of self when you make those decisions to remove yourself. Like even when I would remove myself in Norway and go off and sit in the corner, I'm fine over here, folks. I'm not lonely. I'm decompressing. And this is a celebration of self. Your decision to leave is a celebration of self. And you belong back to your body again. It's like creating this communication with your body is, I think, one of the most important things as a neurodivergent person. I always thought that my neurodivergence was from being highly gifted, which is a specific type of neurodivergence. I'm not going around saying, oh, I'm super intelligent and smarter than everybody else. It's a type of neurodivergence where there are more neuropathways in the brain and there are more pathways between the different parts of the brain. And so there's just more activity. And I thought that was the kind of neurodivergence I had. And so I would, a celebration of self for me would be engaging in certain activities. They're called overexcitabilities for gifted folks, where, I would either just let myself dream and go into imagination mode, or I would get involved in highly intellectual conversation, and that would like actually calm my nervous system down because I had an outlet. I didn't realize that. And I also thought I'm also very introverted, which surprises people because I can
be personable and outgoing. Um, I didn't realize that what I actually needed oftentimes was downtime, and that was because I'm autistic. And so those have been new things. I think that's what's interesting too, getting a later diagnosis is, like you're saying, some of the things you're figuring out have just been more recent in terms of what your needs are. Once you get this diagnosis, it doesn't mean that you automatically know what to do.
No,
You know?
no, definitely not. And that's a great point. Is like there's so much unlearning and there's so much learning that has to go into something that is life altering because, like I said before, the autism's not going anywhere, right? So, like, I now have to figure out what to do with all of these things. It's okay for me to say, oh, there's a reason why when my friends ask me to go out to eat, I choose the same 4 or 5 places over and over. And they're probably like, I'm so sick of this. So, newfound language to put to experience or behavior is really important too, to say, this is why this is happening, especially within like close groups of people that you feel safe with, because I think that sheds further light on behavior, um, decision making, etc. And I think it's really important to just like continuously evolve with that. And I'm still learning about stuff all the time. Like when I do my podcast with Megan, she would not
She's
want to hear,
brilliant.
but she's brilliant. And it's just a different level of understanding things. And I'm just sitting there like, I don't understand this and I'm experiencing this. So it's just constantly having to learn and revisit and explore and be curious too.
We aren't necessarily experts on what autism is. I'm an expert on my experience, but I'm still figuring out what it's called. Like I'm still figuring out what the connection is between being autistic and the experiences I'm having. And I don't know that I can separate them. And so I'm still trying to sort through all of that.
Yeah, it's super nuanced. I think that kind of goes back to just living in a pretty ableist society, right?
Yeah.
And that even goes back to like ableist based language, which is not affirming for when we're talking about like high versus low functioning. And that's why we're trying to move into a world where we're talking about support needs opposed to functioning. Because like if someone 2.5 years ago, if I was telling people about this diagnosis, a lot of people would be like, but you own 2 businesses, like you are so successful, like you got a master's degree, which is so ableist. And the reality is like, yeah, but you don't see the support needs that go on behind the scenes in order to like accomplish anything. Um,
Yeah.
or the level of autistic burnout that I experience on a pretty consistent basis, or the intense emotional like shutdown, sensory meltdowns, the depression that comes with all this stuff, all the things. Like sometimes the substance use, honestly, like if I have to be social and in an environment for 5 days with 30 people, it's not really easy to go through that without drinking alcohol for me because I'm like, my system will not settle down. I will not be able to participate in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of support needs that go on behind the scenes. And I think like when we talk about high versus low functioning and how it's not really affirming to talk in those terms, we talk about that in like my perception of that, especially at first, would be like low functioning autism would be like, oh, someone who's nonverbal, they might need a device. But in reality, it's like, if we're talking about it from a support need perspective, it's more like that person needs some moderate levels of support to be able to communicate effectively in a verbal sense. So they might need a communication device, and that's a support need. And that person might be brilliant in every other sense of the word, but we don't know that if we're not giving them the right kind of support, and vice versa. So similarly to someone with quote unquote high functioning autism, you're not seeing how much support need goes into someone who's doing A, B, C, D, and E with executive functioning challenges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, so much ableism rooted in this, and trying to move away from the words like autism spectrum disorder, definitely moving away from the word Asperger's, moving away from a lot of this terminology that we've used for so long. And even when I'm doing talks on this stuff about language and how important and powerful it is, people, mental health professionals especially, are like, I don't see a problem with any of this. Like, I don't see a problem with using these terms. This is DSM based. If the DSM says ASD, then that's what I'm going to say. And I'm like, I hear you. But like at the same time, if we're saying autism spectrum disorder, what is really the definition of disorder? And if we're going to go down the medical model and we're going to talk about like, this is another instance of like, we're trying to separate ourselves from this diagnosis of saying like, but if it's a disorder, it's something I can manage. It's something I can, reduce symptomology with. I'm going to separate myself from it over here. And in reality, it's like, but that's not possible. Like, this is always going to be impactful. It's a disabling condition for a reason. So there's a lot to continue to learn.
So one of the things that I keep hearing from folks is, oh, you're just really high functioning. I'm like, it's so ableist. I get told how lucky I am. That's the word that I get used that I hear all the time. You're so lucky to have a partner who does A, B, and C. You are so lucky to have a partner that makes you lunch every day. You're so lucky to have a partner who helps out with the kids. What? First of all, there's so much that happens beyond the ableism. It's the intersection of so many things as well, particularly being a woman who also has physical limitations. I'm like, the fuck are you talking about? I'm so lucky. First of all, I'm kind of badass in some ways in life, like many of us. I'm super creative and I have so much creativity that runs through me that maybe I need 4 assistants to actually help out. And I'm working my ass off. Not that I have to prove that to anyone, but there's so much energy that's flowing through. I don't know how one person could manage all of that. I really, really don't, in terms of if I didn't have a support team, whether that is physically, where I need support in terms of, just basic needs and food and water and that kind of thing, and getting laundry done and that kind of thing. But also just in terms of like my creative energy that comes through and helping that come to fruition. Even making this podcast, we have an amazing team because I don't have the time or the capacity to deal with the production aspect of a podcast. That doesn't, that's something that a lot of people don't see happening behind the scenes, is all the support that I get. And they ask me all the time, how do you do it? And I say, well, I have a big support team. And then they say, you're so lucky. It's this weird mind fuck that goes around and round and round and round. Don't love it. Don't love that at all.
I think it's, one of those things that's important to continue to talk about, continue to shed light on and illuminate. And it's helpful, to advocate in that way too. When we're talking about this stuff, we're doing advocacy work at its purest form, really. So I think that it's important to continue to do that in all areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm wondering, in terms of your interpersonal relationships, how this diagnosis has impacted your sense of belonging pre and post. And when I say belonging, I'm specifically talking about the experience of being seen, the experience of being embraced, and the experience of being celebrated.
Yeah, I think beforehand, I probably didn't feel like much belonging in that sense, in any regard. I know, like, my wife is unbelievably supportive emotionally all the ways, but like, it was really hard to like take it in. Otherwise, I felt pretty isolating in a lot of ways, including interpersonally. And after post-diagnosis, I think that things have really shifted in a lot of ways too. Like, for example, little things, right? Like if she's going to use the air fryer in the house, she actually brings it on the porch because she knows like the smells will impact me so significantly that I won't be able to sleep at night. So it's just like little things like that. Understanding why it's more than just me not wanting to go to a family gathering with a lot of people. Like there's some of that. Like I don't often want to go, but there's a reason behind the not wanting to go. It's like the overwhelm and the emotion, that the tax that it takes. So I think there's just way more understanding of why life feels the way that it feels from all areas. And that goes for friendships, being able to just be like, no, I don't want to do that. No, I don't want to come to that. Yes, I do want to socialize, but I don't want to actually speak while we're there. Like, so I've actually met people for dinner where we both were kind of like, just want to go eat dinner with someone, but I want to kind of do it in silence. So those are really nice things to have. Um, and that definitely feels like there's way more just sense of belonging, sense of understanding, and it feels really affirming for in that regard.
It's not a won't, it's a can't. And that's one of the things that when we were in Norway that I was learning about. It's not that I'm just being stubborn, it's that I really can't. My body can't do this. And so when you're talking about going to certain events and you're saying, "No, I can't do it." It's just a no. Um, One of the things that I've noticed too is in the past, there seemed to be paradoxes in what I thought was my personality, where I could be really rigid at times that would just kind of show up unexpectedly. But generally, I thought of myself as a pretty flexible person. And then there are also things like I think of myself and I've been told, "You're an incredibly patient person." But then there'd be times where I just like, ah, and just like get really, really irritated and seem to kind of fly off the handle. And what I realize is that I am a flexible person. I am a patient person. It's just that it's my nervous system at times that gets activated where it's becoming too stimulated, and that's when I fly off the handle. Not as an excuse. I've learned now how to manage that just in the last few months even. Well, actually for the last couple years, but really committed to it the last few months since I've learned that I'm autistic. And it's not that I'm flexible, it's that I have the needs, as you were mentioning earlier. Have you noticed any kind of paradoxes like that in your own experiences?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's just the realization of like sometimes we have specific needs that we have to adhere to. And the more we push past those, the more we're going to push ourselves into autistic burnout.
Yeah.
Um, and I think one way to combat autistic burnout is to unpack our own internalized ableism, which is sometimes our own perceptions of our limitations or our capacities. So I know I can exceed like in terms of capacity and what I can create. But I also now understand the taxation or the aftermath. And I have to be aware of both all the time because I can move into a space where I can be like, I'm going to create ABC. I'm going to do all the things without any regard for how that's going to actually impact me. And way more often than not now, there's got to be like a cost benefit analysis almost all the time. So if I say yes to do something, it has a cost. Is that yes worth the cost? And I have to evaluate that constantly. And I think that's hard for autistic ADHDers, especially when the ADHD part is like, hey, I need stimulation and I need excitement and I need travel and I need experiences. And the autistic side is like, no, like, please,
Absolute hell
no.
no. Yeah.
So it's one of those balancing acts. And I'm
Mhm.
getting better at it. I think it's still a work in progress, but I think just being able to see some of that stuff from a different lens is super helpful too.
It's interesting because one of the things that I've gotten from creating this practice is a sense of community and a true sense of belonging, and also learning that so many of the people that I work with are also neurodivergent. And then as I start looking around my world more, the people that I have felt the closest relationships with, meaning that I felt most at ease and most myself, meaning less camouflaging, less masking, deeper sense of embrace from them, are the people that are also finding out that they're neurodivergent. It's like we find each other somehow or another.
Oh, totally. I would say the majority of my friend group would be autistic ADHD. It makes a lot of sense. You start to understand that better. I think you start to realize like certain relationships are more meaningful than other relationships. Um, and I think that makes a magical difference when you are feeling like an outcast or feeling like you don't belong or feeling like you don't fit in or you've never arrived, to be around other people who get it without having to explain it, um, is really soothing in a lot of ways.
And I just want to also say that I love my brain.
I really love my brain. I wouldn't trade it for anything else in the world. I love the creativity that comes with being autistic. I love the deep empathy, well beyond compassion, but the deep empathy, especially, learning how to manage it. I think as a therapist, that's one of the great gifts is having been a therapist and learning how to manage the empathy that I didn't know how to manage in my younger years. And being able to pick up on things like you were saying earlier in other people and having that intuition. There's so many great gifts that come with being autistic. I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah, there are a lot of great gifts, and I think autistic therapists make some of the best therapists, and for that reason, I'm not really practicing as a therapist anymore, but I think it's still a great gift that I have for the people in my life and the people I care about. Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah. So, Patrick, last question. How do you define belonging? Or what does belonging mean to you?
I think it's, for me, feeling seen, feeling understood, feeling cared for. But I think the feeling understood thing is the most important piece for me. I've often said, like, feeling seen and understood is more important than, like, if someone says, I see you, I understand you, it feels more powerful to me than I love you.
Mhm.
And I think that feels true to this day. So I think that for me, that really does feel all encompassing in terms of what feels important to me.
Somebody really knowing you in a
Hmm.
sense. And that's what seeing someone is there's a knowingness there that can be really comforting. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. When people say they love me, I'm like, okay, I don't know. Am I supposed to say that back?
Exactly. I was like, and what exactly does loving me mean? That's where we start going to that analytical space. So I appreciate you so much, Patrick, and thank you so much for being here today. I know our listeners are really going to benefit from hearing our experiences and particularly all of your wealth of knowledge, which we could never capture in an hour. But thank you so much for being here today. And I do see you and I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on.